Okay, I understand you were in South America last week, and so we're moving north. And you can see in the small inset there the region that is shown in some detail here. My work started at what on this map is called Rupert House. In Cree it's Waskaganish, and I'll refer to it as Waskaganish. But I've been in most of the communities on both sides of the bay. This was a land and resource use study that we did in the 80s, and that's why that part of it is shaded, but we're not really going off that way. I just wanted to give you some sense of location and some sense of what the land looks like. This is what most of the land looks like there. Lots of bush. This is part of what's called the circumpolar boreal forest. It extends right the way around the globe with a few holes. And it's characterized by black spruce and lots of lakes. And it looks to people who are not familiar with the terrain like a fairly forbidding place to try to get a living. You're not only going north, but you're going into a different ecological adaptation. We're talking hunters here, and I understand that the other people that you've studied were not hunters. But these are people who, if we were to put it ungraciously, would say are predatory carnivores, but we can be more gracious than that and say that they depend for their lives on being able to kill animals and eat them. Now, that makes death a very common and very important thing. The ability to hunt an animal, as I say in there, as my first wife and I say in that chapter, depends upon maintaining a good relationship to animals, because the Crees traditionally believed that the animals give themselves. It is their purpose on earth to give themselves so that humans can live. And if they should change their minds, humans will starve. Okay, that's what the land looks like from a plane. Here's a small community. This is Wiminji, a little bit up the coast on the Quebec side, a couple of 100 miles. And you can see the roofs of houses there. Although they have snow on them, you can see the rectangular shapes towards the bottom there. But these are very small communities, a little larger now than they were before. And so this is the community where people gather, are gathered. Nowadays they're year-round communities, but 40 years ago these were summer vacation communities. People spent their winters in the bush in family-sized groups. This is Waskaganish from across the river, and you wouldn't know that it's much of a village. There are just a few dark spots there that don't look like they're trees. I hope you can see some sort of rectangularity there. And everybody who does northern research has to have a story about getting lost. Okay, this is my story about getting lost. A fellow named Bertie Diamond made me some gorgeous snowshoes, and I was going to be going out on a trap line, and I wanted to get a little bit of practice on them. So I went across the river and into the bush on a day when you can see there's no sun there, no shadows to speak of. And I got about as far as the grass in front of the building there, I guess, and lost my bearings. And because there was a little bit of movement of air there, the snow filled my tracks. So I really didn't know where I was. And so in floundering around and being nervous, I fell down. If you fall down in 4 feet of snow, you just sort of put your hands down, they don't really touch anything. And you wonder how to get up again, okay? And the way you get up is that you reach back and grab a hold of the front of the snowshoes, and you sort of scoot yourself back so that you're kneeling on the snowshoes, and then you can stand up again. Fortunately, there was a guy with a chainsaw working about a quarter of a mile away, and I heard the sound of his saw, and I could remember where he had been before, so I headed back, found the river, and that was the sight that greeted me. Doesn't look like much to you, but it looked wonderful to me, because the next place where there was something just that small was 100, 150 miles further on in the bush, going either way, and the chances of finding it would be fairly slim. So, very welcome site, even though it's not much to talk about at this point. Here is Wimenji again in the summer to show how much the terrain changes. Everything looks fairly lush here, and you've got willows and alders and other scrubs near the riverbank. Fairly large rivers, as you can see, fairly shallow, but very flat land. And here is a hunting group coming back from a winter in the bush. This happened to be 1963. And Stuart Stevens is carrying a polar bear skin on his back, which is fairly unusual for the south end of the bay. But kids and everybody are carrying things up from the shore. And one of the Hudson's Bay Company warehouses where canoes were made is behind them there. And this is the village of Muskagonish, Anglican church facing the river over on the right-hand side there. And further on with the red roofs, the Hudson's Bay store, and then people's homes and the odd teepee. And in the summer, people will go out and sit in a teepee because it's a sunshade and you have air passing through. It's a little cooler and comfortable. Or you can use it for smoking fish or moose hides if you're working hides and so on. So teepees show up as well as frame houses. There's some hydro there, so this must have been in the mid-70s, I would guess. Hockey rink, don't have to explain that. And new housing as a result of the Bay James project, which was about $20 billion worth of hydroelectric development in the 1970s. There was an agreement reached between the Crees, the provincial government, the federal government, and part of the result of that was some rather nice housing built there. This is housing sometime before. This is a dome-shaped tent. This is 1963, and it's at the next community up, East Main, and a couple of kids in the doorway. The poles on the sides are to keep the wind from blowing away the canvas tarps. It's a fairly unusual style for this region. Usually they're out in the prairies. And here's a regular bush teepee. This was a trapping camp. In fact, those are my snowshoes sticking up there with the red and white tassels. And a lynx without his insides hanging from the pole there. The lynx is put up so that the dogs won't pull it down and spoil the fur. And two families are living in that teepee, and it's dug down into the ground for warmth and for comfort. Here's the inside of a teepee. This happens to be a summer teepee at Wimenji, but it shows it's a very intimate, warm, pleasant place to be. It's like a 20-foot circular sofa or something like that with a fire in the center. And you can see a kid in a hammock over there. That's the way small children were kept. And this is John Paul Murdoch in his crib. He is now a lawyer in Montreal and works some of the time for the Grand Council of the Crees and is in a firm that has 80 lawyers in it, which boggles the mind, but he didn't turn out too badly. This is Jimmy Whiskey Chan. He's trapped a beaver, and you can see he's kneeling on his snowshoes, although that snow is hard packed. He doesn't need to. It's just convenient to not take the snowshoes off while he takes the beaver out of the trap. This is the kind of thing that Canada was built on for the first quite a few years, the fur trade, and it continues to some extent even now. There's also about 30 pounds of good meat on that beaver, very good meat, fairly rich. And What else do I want to say about trapping beaver? He will treat it well. When he takes it out of the trap, you drag it back and forth on the snow in order to smooth the fur so that it looks reasonably well. And then he'll pull it back to the teepee that you saw earlier on. I'll just tell you a little bit about this as an example of the kind of relationships that people have to the animals that they kill. When a man kills a beaver, traditionally, he would take it back using a dragging cord, which I think you'll see in a minute, to the teepee, and then he would open the teepee door, the flap, and put the beaver inside, and he would wait outside. His wife would welcome the beaver. Now, that sounds a little hokey, but it's not. This is living, okay? This is where food comes from. This is beaver skin is worth something in dollars. And the idea is that you welcome the beaver as a guest, and there is more intimacy if the woman welcomes the beaver with the man outside. Nothing kinky going on here. It doesn't matter whether it's a male beaver or a female beaver, something like that. It's just a welcome, okay? It is a friendly thing to do. And that's what I want to emphasize, a friendly thing to do. You've just killed this animal, and you treat it in a friendly way, okay? So killing or the death of the animal is not an aggressive act. It is an assertive act. It is a terminal act, if you want to put it that way. The whole purpose is to catch that food. But it's not an aggressive act. It's not done in anger, and there's no gloating, with a very few exceptions, where it's been a very difficult hunt, and sometimes you'll get a little comment of triumph at the end of it. But by and large, it's a friendly reception. Okay, here's the dragging cord. It's made of woven caribou skin. It's dyed with a red dye that comes from the bark of alders, and it has some decoration on it. And this is to add something a little bit of a flourish, I guess, to bringing the beaver or other animals. Each type of animal has its own nimaban, its own dragging cord. And this also is respect. You don't use somebody else. You don't use a goose cord for a beaver or a beaver cord for a bear, and so on. So you make a little fuss over the animal that you've got. And this will stand you in good stead when you're looking for that kind of animal again. The length of the cord is very practical. It just has to be long enough to clear your snowshoes in the back, so there's no particular symbolism there. Very pragmatic. These are beaver skulls, and they've been put up also out of respect. It's not a burial, but it's the same sort of thing. It is the respectful disposition of the remains of the dead. Okay, and they are put up there. And the explanation you'll get is so the dogs won't get them, crunch the bones and treat them disrespectfully. But it also has a kind of a good look to it. If you come upon something like that, you come upon a camp that has been inhabited by a family that has eaten well, and the man who is responsible for getting the food has shown his competence as a hunter. And so it's a picture of success. A bear's ears with a bit of the forehead connecting it, up there for the same reason. Bear chins. If you kill a bear, it's quite a haul to bring it back yourself. It's heavy, and especially if you don't have a crust on the snow, it's really a bit much for one person unless you want to cut it up first. And so a person will take a souvenir, a memento of the bear, and present that to somebody in the camp, possibly an elder, or possibly his wife, or if he wants to give it to somebody, then that's who the bear chin would go to. But these are kept, and they're decorated with beads. And there was one old man at one inland community who was said to have had a string with 90 of these things on it. Anyway, again, it's a way of treating the remains of animals in a kind of a celebratory way. This is kind of dark, but these are bear skulls, and put up for the same reason. That's a lot of meat, and bear is an even more succulent meat than beaver. And so people have lived very well there in the preceding winter. One more, you can get a better view of the teeth there, I guess. These are black bear. They're not normally dangerous, although there are stories. And they're not terribly difficult to kill. In the winter, the bears are hibernating, and usually they'll find the den, and they'll see encrusted around a rather small opening from the bear's breath. They can tell that there's a bear in there because it leaves a residue, and so they will call the bear. The bear wakes up, kind of groggy, and comes out, and the man hits it on the head with an axe, and that's that. It's not too arduous a thing. This is a little wicked, but I'll just tell you a brief story. Polar bears are different, okay? And I have a friend whose father hunted polar bears. This must have been when rifles were pretty hard to come by, around the turn of the 20th century. He would go out with a harpoon. He was an Inuit with a harpoon, and find the bear, and the bear would chase him, and he would run from the bear, and when he could feel that the bear was almost on him, he would jump to the left, because the bears are right-handed, and they have a slower time making the adjustment. And as the bear came by him, he'd hit him up underneath the arm with his spear. It takes remarkably good timing and a lot of nerve, but he did survive into an old age. And these bears are not like that, and I have never done anything remotely like that myself, and have no interest in trying. A bear's skull there, and an old lard bucket full of goose bones. Doesn't look particularly grand. It's old. They were put up there, again, to keep the dogs from getting them, and as a kind of respectful disposition of the bones. You keep them separate, but you don't have to be fastidious about it. There's a lid on the can, and that's enough separation. You wouldn't mix bear bones and goose bones and beaver bones and so on. That also would be disrespectful. Okay, we're getting a little more ceremonial now. This is a bear necklace. A man who was going to hunt a bear would wear this during the hunt, and if he's successful and the bear gets brought back to the teepee, and inside the teepee while the man waits outside, then the man would go in after a while, and they would put the bear necklace on the bear's chest, a little bit of dried beaver meat that they'd kept through perhaps some hardship, and they would make a little feast off the beaver meat first, offering the bear a little bit of beaver grease and a little bit of tobacco, and then they would cut up the bear and cook it and eat it. So this is part of a celebration of the relationship between hunters and bears. Here's another one, which I happen to have. And this one is interesting because the figure on it is probably a figure for a human spirit. You can see the blue arms, the legs with the red tassels at the bottom, and then the inverted diamond shape and a little bit of a head up at the top there. And we don't have unanimity on this from the experts, but and I'm talking about the Indian experts, but some of them believe that it is that. Others believe that it's a thunderbird, which is also a spiritual thing. And the old man that was explaining it to me said, well, this is what he called Biesukan. Biesu is a big bird. It could be a thunderbird. Kan means it doesn't fly anymore. This is something that is, that suffix is usually used to mean something manufactured, and this, of course, was manufactured. But its purpose is the same, and it was used in a similar way for a bear feast. This is the head of the first goose that a boy kills, age 10, 11, 12, somewhere in there usually. And his mother will take it and clean it out inside, stuff it with feathers, and decorate it with beads. And then she'll hang on to it till he's old enough to take proper care of it. And when he's an adult, she'll give him the goose head, and he will have that through his life as a kind of an emblem of his relationship to geese. And when he dies, it will go on his grave pole. And I mention this in the chapter as well, perhaps indicating hopes for a continuation of that relationship with geese into the next life, whatever that may be, wherever that may be. It would be hard for a Cree to imagine it without geese. Anglicans. From the 1850s, and the early missionaries for the Anglican Church tended to stay for 25 or 30 or 35 or 40 years and to learn Cree and to preach to people in Cree and to translate the Bible and hymns and so on into Cree and provide the Cree syllabic versions of those. It was not a nasty imposition. One of the reasons it was not a nasty imposition was because the difference between Anglican spirituality and traditional Cree spirituality is fairly fundamental. The Cree spirituality is bush-oriented. I've just shown you some of it, or talked about some of it, in talking about the relationship with animals, which is not just practical, but is also spiritual, okay? It is believed that those animals have spirits and that they should be treated with respect, otherwise you won't see them again. What the Anglicans brought was quite separate from that. It was a kind of I guess we could call it an urban spirituality. And people were very interested. After all, spiritual help is potentially a pretty valuable thing. And so the Crees incorporated what they wanted to. They also had difficulty in understanding the whole premise behind Christianity, and some of the early missionaries were quite frank in their concern. Delegation comes to them and says, "We really appreciate your words in the sermon, but we can't understand them. Even though he's speaking to them in Cree, we can't understand them." Why should that be? I'll give you a very simple-minded example. Christ says, "Feed my sheep." Put that down in the northern bush, and what have you got? Feed my caribou? I don't think so. You know, they're off getting their own food. What is this kind of relationship that's being talked about there? For the Anglican minister, it was a metaphor for the way that a spiritual leader provides spiritual nourishment for his flock, but it doesn't translate very well. So a lot of this didn't translate, and that's one of the reasons why conflicts were not that much of a problem. Okay? People incorporated what they could understand and what they liked, and they could make a difference in their minds between the words and the person giving the words. So you get missionaries in who are somewhat less gifted human beings than others, and people can dismiss that. Well, that's him. Okay, that's not the same as the words that are being spoken. This is not very clear, I guess, but here's a kind of a combination. It's a tombstone, and the Crees believe, and many other people believe too, that when a person is dying, they like to think back on what they enjoyed most about their lives. This man had a passion for goose hunting, and so his grandchildren, in this case, had a tombstone made and with the geese painted on it to recognize that memory of their grandfather. Okay, here's a death that occurred in the bush. Annie gave birth, and this was at the trapping camp that you saw pictures of a few minutes ago. The baby was bleeding not from the navel, but around the navel. They were unable, although they tried hard, to stop the bleeding, and the baby died. One of the difficulties with being isolated families in the bush is that you've got limited medical resources. And this was 1969. You don't have two-way radios to call for help, and it's too far to try to trek with a seriously ill person. So the baby died. Annie wanted a picture of this. I didn't take it out of morbid interest. She asked me to take this picture because she didn't know that they would be coming back to this area at all, and if at all, maybe not for many years. So it was at that request. They asked a bush pilot to fly in a bouquet of plastic flowers. But the grave marker is a pole, a spruce pole that's been stripped of its bark. And this is pushing it a little further than Annie might have if I had asked her. The pole is a symbol of new life, okay? It's a young tree. And they'll leave the tuft of new growth at the very top and skin off the rest. And these poles have other uses, which I think we'll see in a minute. And this is, if it had been an adult man, there would be a goose head hanging from that pole as well. Mysticocan. Mystic is spruce, and I don't know what the co means, but the con, again, is a made thing. This is not a real spruce anymore because it's been modified by human use. Okay, Malcolm Diamond on the left, his wife Silda on the right. Malcolm was chief at Waskaganish for about 12 years. He was an extraordinarily capable man as a hunter, but particularly in managing human relationships and in managing relationships with animals as well. And there's lots of Malcolm stories, but I don't think I can go into that. Malcolm's death in 1984 is mentioned in the chapter as well, and we went to that. Silda's death came much later in 2000, and by that time my own wife had died, and so I went up and took part in that funeral, and I want to talk about that now. First I'll talk about, well, no, Silda's is the one I want to talk about. About half of her kids had decided to go with the Pentecostal church, and about half of them were still Anglican. And she didn't know how to keep the family together with that kind of a separation, but it was her concern to do everything she could, so she went to both. And she encouraged her children to not be critical of each other for denominational reasons. And this was only partly successful. One of their sons, Billy Diamond, was the Grand Chief of the Grand Council during the years of the Hydro Project and negotiated the James Bay Agreement and had an audience with the Pope and became a kind of a media figure. And his older brother, Charlie, only got as far as grade 6, could speak very little English, and was very, very good in the bush, and would comment about Billy only that he was no good in the bush. Okay? And Billy would think to himself that Charlie wasn't too good at negotiation either. But there was a gap, a big cultural gap there. Other kids, one of them was Annie, whose baby's grave you saw there. Another one is Gertie, who lived with my family for 2 years in the late 60s, and with whom I'm still very good friends. And she is now in her 25th year with the Cree School Board, is a justice of the peace, is a member of the band council, has adopted 4 children, and has generally done pretty well for the first high school graduate in the history of that community. She's not too keen on Billy, partly because of his ego and partly because of his Pentecostalism. But she keeps the peace. She won't run for chief as long as he's interested in running for chief, that kind of thing. Well, when Silda was dying, she had her kids around her, and she said, I want you to look after each other and to love each other. And this made an impression. It was a kind of a request of her children to promise her to do that. And they tried it with some success. When I got there, she was in the living room of the house, and there were a lot of family there, just as there was when Malcolm died. And after I'd been there a couple of hours, a group of people came to the door who were dressed, the men in tuxedos. It was kind of a surprise for this kind of thing. Well, it turned out it was a wedding party. There'd been a wedding scheduled for the same day that Silda was to be buried. And so they offered to postpone the wedding. And Billy said, no, Mom loved weddings. She wouldn't want you to do that. Go ahead with the wedding. So they said, okay, well then, will you come to our feast? Okay, inviting them to come to the feast. The reason I'm telling you this story is that it tells you something about the way people live in community in a considerate way with each other, and don't want to in any way interfere or disrespect each other. And this was not a community that would make itself into one of the reserve atrocity stories that you can read about in the newspapers. This was a very together community, and people were making that kind of considerate offer. So we went to the feast, and we went to the funeral, and after the funeral, there was a feast given by the Diamond family as well, and with about 400 people at it, I guess. At the funeral, which was held in the Pentecostal church, each one of her kids would take his or her children and spouses up to the front in order, in serial order, and make a little speech. And these things begin with calling out the name of the dead person. Okay. When Billy's dad died, I was there for that, and he made the first speech there, and he got up and he shouted out, "Daddy!" Kind of startled me. And then he went on to talk about what he owed to his father, what he'd learned from him, how much he appreciated him, and so on. When my wife died in 1991, 5 ladies from Waskaganish took a plane down to Hamilton and came to say their goodbyes while she was still alive, which was a very touching thing to do. And then at the memorial for her, Gertie came, and she spoke the same way, Sarah. And she's talking to the person. Okay, the person may be physically dead, but she's talking to the person. And the same when Silda died. Each of her children, in turn, kiss the forehead of their mom. And since I happened to be regarded as family there, I did likewise. It's the first time I've ever kissed a corpse. I didn't find it difficult. It's just dry skin, and but different for me. And then Billy made a speech. Mom's last words were that we should look after each other. And the peculiar part was that he had walked over and he was standing behind me with a microphone, because there's 400 people there, with his hand on my shoulder, and I wasn't sure what was happening here, because I'm connected to that family mainly through Gertie, more than through Billy. But then he said, he loved all of his siblings, and he said, to my astonishment, "I love you, Dick." And there's no reply for that. At least I never been able to think of one. But the idea was that we were all to be the recipients of his love. And this was his mother's mandate. I'm sure she never mentioned me, not trying to get into the family that way. But there was another aspect of it. Billy's younger brother, immediately younger brother, and longtime rival, Albert, commented to me afterwards that it sounded like the beginning of a political campaign when he starts when he starts telling everybody he loves them. Yeah. And so that's about all I have to say on Silda's funeral. And that's the end of the slides. Now, I talk a bit in the article about my reaction to the death of my friend Willie. And I had a very difficult time with that, partly because I felt that I was in some measure responsible for it, and partly because it was the first time I had been present when a person died, even though I was by that time 32 or 3 years old, I guess, but fairly insulated from it. And so that puts me at a contrast with people like Willie and people like the others you've seen here who see death routine. Animals' death routinely, humans' death less often, but very much a part of the way the path goes. I like the notion of life being a path. It's a common enough metaphor, I guess, but I think it really has deep meaning in Cree culture. And I like the idea of people like Gertie's uncle putting on his best clothes and his new moccasins and going out to meet his death. There's a kind of, it's not a conspicuous act. It is a person deciding that this is the way they prefer to go. Not gladly, I guess, but willingly, having no choice. And I noticed when Silda was being prepared for the funeral that Gertie slipped some new moccasins on her feet. So that still continues on. Now, a lot of what I've described to you has changed. 40 years is a long time when you've got massive modernization going on in the region and schools and so on. But a fair amount of the sentiment that goes with it has not changed, and some of these particulars. Yeah, let's go to questions.
Could you tell us the story of how you left the community one time in a hurry and didn't say goodbye to people, and what people told you?
Okay. I'm so happy to be able to announce that it wasn't me, it was a colleague who will go unnamed, but it was a Cree community. He had been a recipient of hospitality in this house. The house had filled up with relatives so that people were sleeping on the floors everywhere. And he had an early plane out, and he knew that the woman of the house was pretty beat from looking after all these people. So he woke up early, gathered up his things, snuck out the door and walked down to where the airstrip was. About the time that the plane was coming in, a car comes booming down the road. It's a taxi. She can't afford a taxi, but she has taken a taxi, got out, and walked up to him and said, "Don't you know that the only thing we have between ourselves and death is friends?" Which means never go away without saying goodbye. It throws the friendship into question. You know? He was stunned. When he told me the story, I was stunned. You know, yeah, that's right. That's a reason to say goodbye. I saw a fellow by the name of Alec Wischi, who was not given to being too demonstrative of affectionate emotions. And his father was going out to hospital and might not return alive. And Alec went down and publicly kissed his father. It's the only time I ever saw a man kiss another man while I was there. And it was the same thing. He didn't expect to see him, and he had to tell his father that he loved him. And the only thing we have between ourselves and death is friends, is a way of cutting through all the merchandise, right? And stocks and bonds and stuff like that. When it comes right down to it, what matters is the relationship you have to people. And if you've lost somebody who's close to you, and you weren't greedy for an inheritance, you will know what I'm talking about.
The question is, will he explain Windigo?
Everybody's heard of a Sasquatch, okay? Sasquatches are big, hairy, scary, and always just out of sight back in the bush. The Windigo is like a Sasquatch with one addition. His diet is people. Okay? Now that makes him monstrous. It is much better to die as a human being than to become transformed into a Windigo. And because there you are really lost. A Windigo is without friends, without relations, without any kind of good relations. Human beings live because animals give themselves so that human beings can eat them. That's the way it ought to be. There's a very firm line drawn between food animals and human animals. The Crees know that they are animals, nothing ambiguous about that, but they also know that eating another person is a very, very dangerous thing to do. Okay? It has happened on occasion. The occasions are few, the starvation extreme, and the consequences were believed to be that a person would lose his interest in eating anything else if he survived. And there's lots of stories of starvation, and a few stories of Windigo, and in order to kill a Windigo, you have to have a man with considerable spiritual power, and you have to burn them. You have to completely destroy the corpse, or it will regenerate. It's unnatural in a profound sense of that word. It is unnatural for humans to eat humans, and for a person to crave eating humans is beyond it. Okay, it's also believed that if that happens, and if the person does become Windigo, they will become bigger, stronger, crazier, more damaging, and so on. Now, this has been a really popular subject, okay? There's been quite a lot written on Windigo, or Windigo psychosis, as some people say it. I spent a year reading stuff on the Windigo quite a while ago, and I came to the conclusion I was not going to waste any more time on it. It was bad stuff. Even good scholars begin to sound a little bit off the wall when they get into cannibals. And we don't have any first-hand evidence that it ever happened. no first-hand evidence. We've come close. We even have some legal transcripts from back in the 1800s of trials where a man confessed, but people confess to things. So the problem with all of this literature on the Windigo is that although it's really dramatic stuff, we've diagnosed the illness without seeing the patient. And that's not a good move. What it means to people who know these stories and pass them on is something else. It is, this is not the way to live. This is the worst thing that a person can do. Most of these stories are guidance for living of some kind or other, whether it's guidance for hunting, guidance for getting along with people, guidance for getting along with animals, guidance for getting yourself out of sticky situations. But the Windigo offers nothing helpful except don't do it. The remarkable thing is that there are so many cases of people who literally starve to death without resorting to cannibalism. And I've got quite a lot of those, because a lot of people did starve, particularly in the late 1800s. And that required a conscious decision on the part of each one of the survivors not to try to save themselves by eating from the body of somebody who had died and who was there. That was available meat. It might have saved their lives. They would rather die than do that. And they did. So Windigo is an extreme. And it's useful for trying to understand what the Cree world looked like, because it anchors something that I guess would, I don't know what we would find as an equivalent in our own worldview. Maybe hell. Okay, it's beyond redemption. Now, there used to be some people who thought that you could cure a person who was going Windigo by feeding them bear grease, which is one of the very most nutritious things around and gives you a lot of warmth. And Windigo is pretty cold. And there have been theories on Windigo psychosis as a vitamin deficiency, and Windigo psychosis is this and that and the other thing. But all of these are a diagnosis without seeing the patient. Don't know.
Tell me why you included that sentence. It seems sort of, it's definitely affectionate, but it has a feel of casting, in a sense, sort of a judgment, or somehow.
Yeah.
I found it curious.
It was a judgment. It was a statement of respect. And so in that sense, and maybe I should have left it out, but I don't, I believe that. I believe that, actually.
Well, I think that comes through in the article itself.
Yeah. There's another reason which is a little more embarrassing. One of the classics in anthropology, published in 1937 by a British anthropologist, E. Evans Pritchard, called Witchcraft, Oracles, and Magic Among the Azandi. And he talks about witchcraft and its uses and abuses. And he winds up saying something like that too, that he feels that the Azandi order their lives as well as anybody he knows. And I thought, hey, that's pretty good. So it stuck with me. I wasn't reading it in 1937. I was just 6 years old then, but yeah. Thank you.